Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you again, Abby, for the, just the honor of being able to show her. I'm going to get all verklempt, but that's what this is going to be about tonight. So, yeah, this is the fourth time we've worked together, and it really was Abby that, kind of launched me in a way on sort of taking the turn from into my own artwork completely. Like, deciding, okay, I'm going to be a full-time artist. And she invited me to put a piece in that show. And then from that, she invited me to do a solo show. And it was like a year and a half away. And I thought, sure, I'll do a solo show. And then I had to think about what I wanted to do. And I also, like Lisa, went to school for art about 30 years ago. A little over 30 years ago, and I was trained very well in abstract expressionism. And I was a painter also. My degree is actually in painting, not in sculpture. But I studied at the Art Students League in New York City for a long time, and I studied the figure. And I also started drawing the figure when I was 15. So I lived in Claremont, California, and Scripps College was one of the 6 colleges that was 2 blocks away from my house. And they had an open session on Saturday with a nude model. And I went over there when I was 15 and started drawing nudes. And my favorite story is that for my senior show in high school, I had been drawing nude men and nude women. And I wanted to put them up on the wall, and they let me put up the breasts, but they didn't let me put up the section of the guy from here to here. So that had to go in the portfolio. But anyway, then I did launch into abstraction, and I think a lot of it was because I didn't feel like I could take myself seriously as an artist in this day and age unless I understood abstraction, because it was not available to me at all. The figure has always been available to me. But in the last 10 years, I've come back to the figure completely and pretty much exclusively. And this show initially was going to be called Absent Presence. And I was really interested in the idea of, it's like when you're walking along a path in the woods and a stone has been dislodged, there's an impression that the stone has made. The stone is no longer there, but the story of the stone is there. So it's absent, but it's present. And I was really thinking a lot in my own life of how the work I make, how much of it is that. And I really have to credit, there's some people in this room, I'm in 2 different critique groups, and they have made a huge difference for me of sharing my ideas with people and getting their feedback. Really had an influence on my work, and I don't think the show would be what it is without that. So you know who you are, and thank you very much. And specifically this piece here of, we kind of call it the yoga piece. It's actually, it's called Practice / Devotion. And it's always been called Practice, but in a yoga class recently, someone was talking about devotion, and I realized that for me, practice is devotion. And devotion is practice. I can't really separate them. But Lisa, actually, whom you just heard speak, just saw her lovely work, we were talking one day in our critique group, and she sort of confessed to me that she loved my work, but in some ways, the ideal bodies, the athletic bodies, she kind of couldn't relate to because of her own experience with the spinal injury and the experience she described of her pregnancy and birth with her twins, who are now 18. And that so moved me, her story so moved me, and so I began to talk about what my story is with regards to why do I do this? Why do I create these bodies the same, in a sense it's the same body. It's not a portrait, like a portrait of a tree. It's actually, for me, these bodies are kind of human potential. Honestly, they're sort of like the body stripped down to the basics of muscle and skeleton and then motion, always motion. So that piece there is really kind of my own story. And I don't think that I would be so fascinated with the body had I not had such a conflicted relationship with my own. So when I was little, I was sexually abused at the age of 4, and that caused me to really hide a lot. And I loathed my body. I was extremely skinny, extremely self-conscious. I wore my collars up to here, my sleeves buttoned down to here, because I didn't want anyone to see my body. And so then I recognized on some level that I was never going to be a whole and complete person unless on some level I dealt with my relationship with my body. There was something missing, like there was a whole life to be lived that I wasn't living. And there was something wrong, and that was not okay with me. And so I started taking dance classes when I was in college, the first time when I was 18 in San Francisco. And I was the worst one. I was the worst one in class. I was such a klutz. When I was a kid, they used to call me fender bender, because I would like run into open doorways, you know? And I was pigeon-toed and bow-legged and awkward. And I was the worst one in dance. And then I was like, you know something? I'm gonna do this. So I took 4 dance classes at a time. I audited 4 dance classes. And then I started taking dance outside. And then I started being obsessed with dance. And I actually moved to New York City to dance when I was 20 years old. And I started studying dance in New York. And I also developed an eating disorder. I was bulimic. I thought I was fat. And then that went on for 10 years. So I also injured myself because I'm hypermobile, and dance classes are geared for people who are super tight. And by following the instructions to always push more and go further, I tore both my hamstrings. I did all kinds of things. So my body was really broken, but I was really determined to live in my body in a way that was what I knew it should be. So that's really what that piece is about. It's really about coming back from broken and about training myself, you know, to live in this body. And from there, I think, you know, when I sculpt these bodies, I can feel my own body. So when I do this and I create this hip and then the fold of skin from the raised hip, I can feel it in my own body. When I sculpt an arm, I can feel my own arm. And I think that there's something about my obsession with the body. It's like it's turned into a love. And when I do yoga, and I've been practicing yoga for 14 years, it's like the joy and the pleasure of living in my body and being in my body is just extraordinary. And that's really where this work comes from. And that piece over there, the painting, actually I painted that 30 years ago in New York when I was in intense therapy for the abuse that I did not remember until I was 32. And it's called Elizabeth's Funeral because Elizabeth is my middle name. And to me, when that happened to me, Wendy, the Wendy person, kind of went in a closet, and Elizabeth said, "I will protect you." And she came out, and I was super competent and super capable and all that stuff. And when I began to discover the other part of myself, I kind of had to kill Elizabeth off to let Wendy live. So that's kind of the adolescent girl rising up out of really the corpse of my caretaker, my Elizabeth caretaker. So anyway, initially this show was going to be more about all of that, absent presence. I don't any longer need that story in my life of having been broken because I'm a really happy person. And I don't need excuses. I don't need a reason to not be successful or not be doing what I want. So I don't tell that story very much. And yet, because of the women that I've shared my work with, I realized that there might be something about that story that was important and that might create access. Because if anything, I want my work to be accessible. And I realized that sometimes bodies like this might not be accessible for everyone. To me, they're inspiring. But to some people, they might be off-putting, or they might feel foreign, or people might compare themselves and suffer by comparison. I generally react to something that I see that's beautiful with inspiration. And I also recognize that if I really want something in my life, I have to be willing to put in the work to get it. Otherwise, it's just a fantasy. It's just a coulda, woulda, shoulda, and I didn't want to live my life like that. So that's kind of where this work is coming from. The piece in the back there, it's called Medusa Reimagined, and the inside of it is actually from a men's magazine from 1962. And if you've ever looked back into literature from that time, it's so sexist and so misogynistic and so belittling of women. And the absent presence there is that that's what I was born into. And I wouldn't wear pink when I was a little girl. I was like, no way you're going to get me to wear pink. I didn't want to be, what I saw in the magazines, and I certainly didn't want to be a bimbo, and I certainly didn't want to be a dumb blonde. So that's a little bit of what that story is, kind of like the story of Medusa and the power of Medusa, kind of, what's on the inside of a powerful woman, coming from that era. So the other thing that I'll say is that this show came at me. I said yes to this show about the same time as I got a phone call, which is one of those phone calls you always want to get as an artist. When someone calls you up and says, "Oh my God, I love your work. I can't believe I didn't know you existed. Would you like to do a giant installation in this new hospital we're building?" And it wasn't quite that simple, but it was one of those calls from Denver where someone basically said, "I love your work and I would like to consider it for this installation." So that was also about the time I had booked this show, about a little over 2 years ago. And I did, in fact, get the job. It took a long time to get the contract. I thought it would be done a year ago, but it just so happened that it coincided completely with working on the solo show. So I kind of went from the idea of absent presence into the idea of doing this installation, which this is basically the postures. These are the small studies, this one and this one are the small studies for what is a life-size piece that is being installed at the new hospital on Interquest and I-25. And so in a way, the show kind of got co-opted by the climbing show, and yet it wound up being so much about the same thing. And as I sculpted these bodies, it's like it gave me permission to push the potential of the human form. Like climbing just requires these postures that are just impossible. When you watch climbing, it's so beautiful what the body is capable of. And I just felt like I got to give into that, like totally give into my obsession with that anatomy and what was possible there. So that's what I did. And then it all came together amazingly. So that there's this sense of absent presence. All of these little pieces that you see on the walls, they're all cast from all of these other pieces. So they're also impressions of something, of the body that's no longer there. But these pieces depend utterly on these pieces. They couldn't exist without them. Just like the packing tape pieces depend on the model that I used. That's the cast of her. The model that I used for this climbing show. She's a climber at City Rock who's just extraordinary. So anyway, that's kind of bringing it around, and I think that's about it. But I'd love to take your questions.
When it says mixed media, what are they actually made out of?
Yeah, otherwise the list would just be too long. Well, these are made, so these little guys here, they're primarily, what you see, the shape is this really fine kind of doll maker's clay. You don't have to fire it. But I used to start out with a little wire armature, and then I would make a little rib cage and pelvis out of aluminum mesh. But now what I do is, what's inside of all these is a little 3D printed skeleton. So I got a little, they're anatomically correct little skeletons that I print, that I actually have one of my cousins prints them out for me. And then I divide them up because they come kind of put together. And then I pose them, and then I re-put them back together. And then there's some hollowness, so the rib cage and the pelvis and the head are all hollow. But then I use the clay, so I pose the skeleton, and then I use the clay, and I add it, and then I subtract it with little tiny files, because my hand can't do these fingers. My fingers are way too big to do those fingers. So I use little tiny files to carve things, and the actual surface is then on top of the white figures. They're completely white when I get done with them. Then I paint them with interference paint. So do you know what interference paint is? Interference paint is this really cool paint that it's got like mica in it or something, so that depending on where you're standing, you get a different impression of the color. And in the case of this one, this is actually interference gold or orange to green. So you'll see hints of orange and green in that one as it turns. And these are actually, this is interference green, interference blue, interference violet, interference red, and then interference gold. So there's just a real subtle shift along the color wheel from this piece to that piece, which of course is intentional. So then on top of that paint, I actually use a very fine paper. So the actual surface is paper, and it's a Thai unru, which has fibers in it. And I put that on the top, and it kind of cuts down on the garishness of that interference paint. And it also sort of gives it, if you look really closely, you can see there's almost veins. I started using it because to me it reminded me of stone with, marble with the veins in it. But I just love it as a surface. I've always loved paper, almost too much to draw on it. I think it's so beautiful. So I've used it as a sculptural surface quite a bit. Does that answer your question?
No, my next question is, how does that relate to the larger ones you did? Is it the same process?
No,
not.
no, not at all. And I guess, again, like I make assumptions because I've been working on it so long that nobody knows what I'm talking about. But the larger ones are done in packing tape. So basically, these were the postures that I worked out for the large sculpture, especially in this little one here. Like I would have this little tiny figure, and then I would pose my model, and according to that, and then I would wrap her in saran wrap and then wrap her in packing tape. So that's how these ones are made. But those are full bodies, and it has to be done in sections because nobody can hold, like this posture for 15 minutes. So I would support her with, pillows and ladders and tables so that I could wrap like a section of her at a time and then put it all together and then reinforce. And then I use heat also, mild heat to kind of pop out some of the curves. Like packing tape has no flexibility. So popping out some of these areas that have these curves, I actually achieved some of that with a heat gun. So the large piece up at the hospital was all these clear bodies that are life size. It's 14 by 20 feet, really big. So thanks for your question.
You're talking about the packing tape. Can you talk about the complexity, like in creases and folds and manipulating around certain muscles? Because the detail on those is amazing around ribs, clavicles, etc. Can you talk about how you do the cross-sectioning and all that?
Yeah, to use the packing tape, so again, it can represent the curves of the body. I you don't use it like wrap something like this. You wrap it in like a fishbone, because then you can get it to go around a curve and represent a curve, as opposed to sort of doing it like this, in which case it would come out kind of square, sort of clunky. So that's how I do.
For these impressions, how much of the color was in the material to start with, and how much of the color did you add or pop? That's
just pieces of fabric. So the color in those is entirely in the fabric. So these, I'm great, with thrift stores. I go to thrift stores a lot. My husband and I call it going to the Museum of Mankind. And I get rayon, silk, or cotton or linen scarves, because the medium that I work with to make that fabric stiff only works on a natural fiber, because it has to soak into the fiber, and polyester, it would just stay on the surface. So this is made out of, these two are made out of rayon, that one is silk. They act really differently depending on the fabric. The fabric's really different one from the next. But I take this scarf and I kind of cut a little bit of a shape in it, and then I take one of these little figures and I wrap it completely with saran wrap, because that fabric stiffener will tear it's like it'll tear the skin off your body practically. It's so hard when it's done. And so then I put the fabric, I dip it in this medium. It's called Paverpal. It's just a fabric stiffening medium. And I wrap it around the figure. And then where it overlaps, I put pieces of saran wrap in between so that I can pry it off. But in the case of making some of these more full-bodied ones, that process can actually rip an arm off of the body. Certainly fingers and toes get broken all the time, but I can fix all that. So, but at the stage before I put the paint and the paper on, when it's just the clay, that's at the point at which I will cast these little figures. But like Lisa's saying that she works for 3 months on a piece, these figures take me 60 hours each to make. So it's really nice to be able to sort of use those to get something else, because it's just, otherwise it's like, ugh. And like Lisa was saying, sometimes too, these things are so precise. It's really nice to work with something that's a little bit more, like I can kind of just I can kind of see what it does. So.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
I just love what you were saying earlier about how sculpting these bodies, and how when you're sculpting the hand or the hip or wherever it is, that you actually feel it within your own body, and how it's enabled you to really love your own body. I think that's just fascinating.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's like a celebration and a triumph. And plus I just love the way it looks. And I love making them. Like, just the pure physical act of making art makes me really happy. So I could sit there forever.
Yeah, I just have a comment too, that I'm just so grateful for your strength and your bravery of sharing your story.
Well, a lot of it has to do with you and Maddie and Nard and Lisa, Ori and Abby and my husband. Well, thank you. Yes. Oh, wait, I have one more thing. Oh my God, my husband printed this out at work today. I have to read this. It's from the poem The Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You've got to know this. But this is the verse. This is the verse for me that I want to share with you. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Okay, now you can.